You know, when we were getting this deep dive ready for you, there was this one thing that really got to me.
Oh,
Yeah, like it really sent chills down my spine. Picture this.
okay.
It's 1993, springtime in D.C.
Mhm.
People are just out and about living their lives.
Right.
And all of a sudden, a car slows down. A shotgun blasts right out the window, and then it's gone. Just like that.
Wow.
That's James Swann, a.k.a. the Shotgun Stalker. We've got a lot to cover here. The crimes, the psychology, the whole legal battle.
Yeah.
It's cute. Where do we even start with a story like this?
Well, I think what really grabs you is how that method, that random drive-by approach, I mean, it would just terrified the entire city.
Oh, yeah.
4 people dead, 5 injured. And in those Mount Pleasant and Columbia Heights neighborhoods, nobody knew who'd be next.
No, you're absolutely right. Just imagine trying to go about your day,
Yeah.
not knowing if, like, stepping outside could be your last thing.
Right.
It wasn't just the shootings themselves. It was this constant threat, like, looming over everything.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a bit more about the psychology behind it all? Especially the insanity plea, because honestly, my first thought was, how can someone who plans their attacks so carefully, how can they be insane?
That's a really good question. And it all comes down to how the law actually defines insanity. It's not about being crazy in like a general sense.
Okay.
Legally, it comes down to whether at the moment of the crime, the person could understand their actions were wrong or not.
Okay, I get that. So help me out here. Swan said he was hearing voices, right?
Yes.
Including, like, Malcolm X's voice telling him to kill.
Yeah, and not just any killings either.
Oh, wow.
Swann specifically targeted Northwest D.C., what he called the civil rights side of town, claiming Malcolm X's ghost was telling him to get revenge for his assassination.
Wow. Okay, even if we just set aside the legal definition for a second, if someone really believes they're getting orders from a ghost, how much control do they actually have? I mean, really?
That's exactly the issue at the heart of this case. It's a really tough question. Delusions can feel totally real. And we have to grapple with how that impacts someone's ability to tell right from wrong.
So where's Swan now? I know he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, but what does that actually mean for him, like, day to day?
Well, he's been at St. Elizabeth's Hospital since 1994, but here's where it gets even more complicated.
Okay.
In 2011, he requested a 12-hour furlough, a supervised visit with his father.
Okay.
And there was some pretty convincing evidence on his side, too. He'd gotten an associate degree in prison, hadn't had any violent incidents since 2003, and the psychologist even assessed him as low risk.
On the surface, that sounds almost reasonable, but then I dug into the sources and found this thing about Swan's father. He gave him a Thrill to Kill t-shirt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which Swan apparently liked to wear. How do you even square those two sides of the story?
That's a pretty jarring detail, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it really makes you question Swann's supposed progress, and his support system.
Hmm.
How could someone who claims to be rehabilitated be okay with something like that, especially considering what he did?
Right.
It's no wonder the judge was concerned.
Makes you question everything. Okay, so let's put this to you directly. If you were the judge, knowing everything we've talked about, the crimes, the psychology, the whole t-shirt thing, would you have granted Swan that furlough?
That's a really tough one. There's the legal aspect, the psych evaluations, and then that gut feeling, right?
Yeah.
About whether someone is actually rehabilitated. And it's not just about Swann's progress, but also the potential risk to the community. It's a decision that weighs heavily on you. There are no easy answers.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for you listening to consider this too. What does justice even look like in a case as complicated as this? Where do we draw the line between punishment, rehab, and public safety?
Yeah, it's a question that goes way beyond James Swann, Cases like this really make us think about the limits of our justice system.
Absolutely.
How do we balance the rights of the individual, even when they've done terrible things,
Yeah.
with keeping the community safe, with giving people that peace of mind?
And how do you even measure something like that?
Yeah.
Peace of mind. I mean, how could anyone in D.C. really feel safe knowing Swan was out, even for a little while?
It's so complex, right? You have legal precedent, psych evaluations, the nature of the crime, the possibility of rehabilitation. I mean,
Right.
it's never a simple equation.
Yeah, speaking of rehabilitation, like, how much weight should those positive changes Swan seemed to make actually carry?
Mhm.
He got a degree, stayed out of trouble for years. That's got to count for something, right?
It does. It absolutely does. And that's why these cases are so hard. There's no easy answer. You're always weighing the potential for danger against the evidence of progress.
Right.
and the scales are constantly shifting.
So in a way, it's kind of like you're trying to predict the future, right?
Right.
Can you ever really know if someone will reoffend, especially when mental illness is part of the picture?
You've hit on a really important point. Risk assessment, especially when you're dealing with someone found not guilty by reason of insanity, it's very complex.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it's not a perfect science.
Right.
Professionals use all kinds of tools and evaluations, but there's no way to see the future, for sure.
Right. Right. It makes you think about this whole concept of rehabilitation. If someone is found not guilty because of their mental state at the time, is there ever a point where we can say, okay, they're safe to go back into society?
It's a question experts are still debating.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
isn't one answer that fits every situation. It really depends on the person, the nature of their illness, how serious their crimes were. It's the constant process of evaluating and then reevaluating.
And then you add in the issue of mental illness itself. We talked about how Swann said he was hearing voices, this whole delusion about Malcolm X. How can you even start to assess someone's risk when what they did is based on something that, to them, feels completely real?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. You have to consider the type of delusions, how they respond to treatment, their overall mental state. And it's important to remember that mental illness isn't just one thing, right? It's a spectrum. Not everyone who has delusions or hallucinations is violent.
It seems like there's so many layers to this.
Yeah.
So going back to Swann's case, they ended up denying his furlough request. What do you think were the biggest factors in that decision?
Well, that Thrill to Kill t-shirt thing, that had to be a huge red flag.
Yeah.
It makes you think that even years later, he's still comfortable with violence in some way. It's not something you can just ignore. And we can't forget that even in 2008, the psychologist evaluating him noted he was still having hallucinations.
That's right. He was still having those hallucinations. And, the sources didn't really say what those hallucinations were like. Were they like the ones back in '93? Were they still about violence? It's a bit unsettling to think about.
It is. And that not knowing is a big part of these decisions. Even with the good signs, the education, no recent violence, there's always that question. Could he keep up those changes outside the hospital, outside that controlled environment?
Right.
It's a gamble, and when you're talking about public safety, it's one that judges don't want to take.
I get it. It's tough all around. And it makes me wonder about the bigger picture. How do we as a society make sure people with serious mental illnesses get the care they need, especially when they've been violent?
That is the million-dollar question. Ideally, we'd have a system that provides both treatment and holds people accountable. A system that keeps the public safe, but also gives real opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration when it makes sense.
It seems like finding that balance is really the key.
It is, and I think James Swann's case reminds us that there aren't easy answers here. It's complicated, it's messy,
Yeah.
and it forces us to face some hard truths about ourselves and the systems we've built.
Going through all of this with you, it makes me think about the human cost of this whole story.
Right.
We get lost in the legal stuff, the psychology theories.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the victims, their families, like
Absolutely.
the whole city of D.C. living in fear.
Yeah, those 14 shootings, the lives lost, the injuries, the trauma that stays with people. I mean, those are the real consequences of what Swann did.
And it goes way beyond the direct victims, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Imagine the impact on families, communities, that feeling of safety just shattered for so many people.
No doubt. Trauma like that leaves its mark not just on individuals, but on whole communities.
Right.
And it can take generations to heal.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And it brings us right back to that question we've been wrestling with. What does justice even mean in a case like this?
Yeah.
Is it about punishment? Rehabilitation? Is there any way to really address the harm that was done?
That's the big question, isn't it? Justice is complicated.
Yeah.
And in Swann's case, there's just no easy answer.
And there are so many different viewpoints to consider, right? The victims and their families, the community, the legal system, even Swann himself. How do we balance all those needs and figure out a way forward?
I think it starts with acknowledging that there just aren't any easy answers. We have to be okay with the uncomfortable parts, with the nuances,
Right.
and recognize that any solution is going to involve compromise and hard choices.
It makes you wonder if the system we have can even handle cases like this. It's all guilty or not guilty, but what about the situations that fall somewhere in between?
You've got a point there. Our legal system, it's good in a lot of ways, but it can have trouble dealing with the complexities of mental illness.
Right.
Sometimes it's not even about guilt or innocence. It's about how responsible someone was and how we should respond.
So what do we do? What can we learn from James Swann's story? What questions should we be asking?
I think one of the biggest lessons here is that we need to understand and be aware of mental health. We need to get rid of the stigma, invest in treatment and research, and build support systems that can step in before something terrible happens.
And what about the justice system itself?
Yeah.
What changes could we make to handle cases with mental illness better?
I think we need to keep pushing for reforms that focus on both accountability and rehabilitation. Programs that address what causes crime, that help people coming back into society.
Right.
And we need to make sure our courts have the resources and the knowledge to handle these complicated cases fairly and with compassion.
Feels like there's so much to unpack here, and we've barely scratched the surface.
It does.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, something to think about, some questions to consider, maybe even a new way of looking at these tough issues.
I agree. These are the conversations we need to be having.
Yeah.
And by engaging with these difficult topics, even if it's not easy, we can move towards a society that's more just and more compassionate.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.